Okay, hi guys. Today we will be looking at a CSQ case. So this series we will focus on micro cases. Over the years, you will have seen that actually for micro cases, there are also a mix of macro concepts, which in this case we will see. This is also because of questions getting harder, more challenging over time. Last time for micro case study, it will just be mainly micro, but now there is a mix. So for case study, the most important thing is to be able to tell what topics the case is trying to test you by looking at keywords of questions and the sources. So without further ado, let's dive into it. This is a case study on beef exports to Japan, as you can see from the question. So usually when students do CSQ, there is a tendency for them to flip open the paper and they start to read the extracts and the cases and then look at the question. However, if you want to really save time in a case study paper, this shouldn't be the way to do it. The way you should do it is that, yes, you should read the case to get a sense of the coverage and then going to the questions and really planning what the question needs through the keywords, interpreting what question want, and then going back to the relevant cases to find the answer. So what I mean by briefly read through is actually to look at the question title, the extract title, because from there you can tell what are some of the possible concepts that the titles are trying to hint at you. And don't go into the content, because when you go into the content without understanding and planning what the question wants, you will just end up reading the whole thing without knowing what you want to find, and this will make you lose a lot of time. So just sharing an example, when I was a student of econs, I used to also flip open the paper, read the cases, and then go to the question. So I realized that when I try to find the answer after reading the question, I will end up reading the case again, and this actually means that the time you spend maybe for the past 10-15 minutes reading the cases first has been wasted because it's not targeted. And this 10 to 15 minutes you might have used it to answer a 8-mark question. So in CSQ, the time is very important. So for if you are looking at H2 Econs Paper 1, you will have 2 CSQ of 30 marks each, and the paper is 2 hours 30 minutes, so meaning 150 minutes. So you have 75 minutes for each 30 marks CSQ. So every minute and second really counts. So we will really want to learn how to save time, how to be very targeted in what you read. Okay, that's the first point. And second point is that students have the misconception that the answer will all be found in the case study. Okay, it depends on the paper, but it is not always true. So what I mean is some cases could be very explicit, straightforward to tell you the hints that they want you to get from certain concept. But we have come across questions where actually the cases are very vague. So they could tell you a certain context and you need to be able to interpret what it might want you to go towards and then make a logical hypothesis of the points. So never ever depend 100% on the cases for your answer. So the steps that you should do is that you should understand what the question wants first and always be backed up by your content. So your content understanding first, then you think of a possible structure for your answer and then look at the case to see if the case supports your hypothesis. Of course, there are questions that are quite vague that maybe you can't really think of the structure on your own. In that case, then perhaps the cases will be more helpful to tell you the answer, but never ever think that all the answer is in the case, because actually the answer should come from your content. The case is to give you the specific context and tweaks along the way. We will explore this case further and then see how this could be done. Okay, so as mentioned, for first step, you should always read the title of the question and the abstract to get a sense of what the concepts may be. In this case, we see that question 1 prospects for beef exports to Japan. Okay, this is a pretty broad question, because when we think of export, we may think of macro econs, your BOT, your globalization that talks about trade between countries. However, we should read more to know the exact concepts. So just keep an open mind and see what the words will remind you of. So always have the active process going on, because you don't want to read the case and then end up not having any takeaway from the case. You will want to read the case, and from each of the sentence, the information they give, try to decipher if this is a problem, a solution, or a concept. So this is very important, a skill that you need to build throughout your econs or JC journey. Okay, so when we look at abstract 1, it talks about changes in the Japanese diet. Actually, when you look at the question, it sort of reminds you of a certain concept, which is change in taste and preferences, which is a micro concept under price mechanism demand factor. So changes in the Japanese diet, it would come from the consumer side, because changes in diet seems to imply that this is a demand. Demand comes from a consumer demand concept. So perhaps this may point us that, this is likely a micro predominant case, because this talks about demand factors. Okay, so we have some idea. Perhaps changes in the diet could be because the question is about beef export to Japan, right? So it sort of links that there is a change in Japanese diet towards preference for beef, which then links well into the point that there is beef exports to Japan. So this is the process that should be in your mind, because this already triggers some sort of concept starting to think of, rather than, okay, I read the abstract and it doesn't mean anything. Actually, the question, the title and the abstract title does mean something. So let's read on. We don't read the content first. Later on, then we read the content. Okay, so moving on to abstract 2, the market for beef imports into Japan. Okay, so for abstract 1, it was the opposite perspective, which is export into Japan. And now this is import into Japan. So perhaps for abstract 1, it is more of how would Japanese perceive the beef, because it comes into the country, whereas this is beef out of the importers into Japan. So this could probably talk about who are the suppliers of beef for Japan. Could be the supply side. So you see how this possibly could be combined with the earlier one, which is about demand. This one could touch more on the supply side, which then makes it even more clear that this is probably a predominantly micro case, because you have the demand and the supply. If this is a macro case, it will be a lot more general, like your aggregate demand, talking about your CIG X minus M, your AD concepts, as well as your short run, long run supply. However, this seems to be quite specific to the beef market, which in this case again is a demand supply concept, because in micro demand supply we learn about the market rather than the economy. So this is probably talking about the market for beef. Okay, moving on. Okay, we see that for the past 2 cases, they seem to be quite long, each taking up about at least half of the page. There is pros and cons to that. If the cases tend to be quite long, it also means they tend to be fewer. Whereas if you see that cases are quite short, maybe just 2-3 paragraphs, then you can expect more extracts that follow it. Okay, but we read on. Okay, so the past 2 cases are about your words, qualitative information. Here you have the data sources. So you see table 1, income elasticity of demand of Japanese consumers for meat products in Japan. Okay, so this is the first explicit concept that they are mentioning, which is your YED. So whenever the cases talk about a specific statistics or data point, we need to be very clear that what is the intent of that. Because there is always a reason why they put certain data. They want you to have a certain inference, which they wouldn't make it very clear at the case lah, because they will then test you at the question. But here we can look at the concept of YED as a recap and remind ourselves what this is for. So we know that for YED, it talks about how the demand for something can be good X changes with a change in your income. So we know that for YED, there are various magnitude. So if the YED is more than 1, it means that this is a normal good. Okay, this is a normal good. And within the positive magnitude, actually there is a difference. So the higher the positive magnitude, this is actually referring to your luxury good. Because for luxury good, when your income increases, the demand for it will increase more. Whereas if it's a positive magnitude but a small number, it would likely imply it's a necessity. Because you can imagine if you are richer, actually the increase in demand, the change in demand towards necessity won't be a lot, because you have already satisfied that need since it's a necessity. So as compared to a luxury good, a necessity won't see so much increase in demand even when your income increases, because there's just so much necessity that you require and it has been already fulfilled for survival purpose. Okay, so on the other perspective, if your YED is less than 0, we know that this means that the good is a inferior good, because when your income increase, you will want to improve your quality of life and consume less of the inferior good. In this case, it would be things that people perceive to be not so good in quality and you only have to consume it when you are poorer, such as second-hand goods, etc. However, this is up to debate lah, because if you see platforms like Carousel is a marketplace for second-hand goods, right? And it doesn't mean that only the lower income buy that. So this is just a generic logical concept. So this one, it will be inferior good. So do take note of this, because when the question states the YED like that, right, they would likely want you to have an inference. So it's good to write out directly what the content may be, so that later when you come to the question, it will be very fast. So I know that I mentioned you don't need to read the cases first, but of course for data sources like table 1, table 2, where it is very little information, you might as well just do that understanding, because you are there anyway lah. So it depends on the question. Those long ones like the extracts 1 and 2, then can just read the title to get a sense. Okay, then we move on to table 2. PED, price elasticity of demand of Japanese consumers for chilled beef imported from different country. Okay, now is a elasticity concept as well, but a different one, PED. So it is again need to be very clear what's the difference between the elasticity concept. So your PED, YED, XED, what's the difference? So here, PED is the relationship between your price and quantity demanded, because it looks at the demand curve, whether your demand curve is gentle or steep. So here, this is regarding how your quantity demanded of a good changes when the price of the good change. So again, for PED, this is less about positive or negative, but more about the magnitude, because for PED, it is always negative. This is because it shows the relationship between price and quantity, and by the law of demand, we learn that the demand curve is a downward sloping line. So you see here in extract 2 for the 3 countries, Australia, US, rest of the world, you always have a negative in front. This is a given. So in this case, the negative doesn't matter so much, but what's more important is the magnitude. So how do you interpret the magnitude? So when we learn about PED, we learn that there are 2 sides of PED. So if it's more than 1, the demand for that good is price elastic. So what does it mean? It means that when the price changes, the quantity demanded actually falls a lot. So this could link back to your possible factors of your PED, such as the availability of substitutes, the degree of necessity of the product, which will then affect the value of the PED. Then on the other hand, you have less than 1, where the demand for the good is price inelastic. So just a point to note, don't say it as demand is elastic, demand is inelastic, because this is not something that exists. It should be the demand is price elastic, because you are looking at price change to determine the change to quantity demanded. So just to be clear, because if you didn't include the price word, you may be marked down for exam, even if you apply the concept correctly. So just something important to remember. Okay, then the fact that for these 3 countries, you have a variety of magnitude. So you see for Australia, it is less than 1. So you can write down to indicate that actually for Australia beef, the demand is price inelastic. So perhaps the question could ask you to come to this inference or give a possible reason why so. Okay, then for your US and rest of the world, the magnitude seems similar. Both are more than 1, price elastic. So if you are able to come out with this conclusion at this point of time, then later on when the question asks, it will be a lot faster. You don't have to think again, because the content is here already. Okay, so moving on, extract 3, the US and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Okay, for this case, it seems like it is a macro source, because when we talk about your Trans-Pacific Partnership, this is actually talking about the concept of trade agreement, and this is under the content of globalization in macroecon. So in this case, perhaps we can skip first, because this session we want to focus on answering the micro question. I would think this is especially helpful for J1 students who are learning your micro content, and J2 students who are looking to revise your micro content, because especially in J2, it will get increasingly harder to revise your micro alongside your macro content, which is equally heavy. So good to always, during your revision, toggle between micro and macro, because you don't want to forget your hard-learned J1 micro content in J2 So good to always revise. So I think doing questions that is a mix is a good strategy. Okay, so sometimes if you are more familiar with case study, your eyes will naturally wander to the content. So for example, when we look at the extract 3 title, my eyes are already looking at words like free trade agreement, the countries, strengthen economic ties, which then further tells me that yes, this is a macro case. So can take note, and yes, things like tariff, manufactured goods, all this. Yeah, so we don't cover this first. Yeah, this case actually extends all the way until the second page. So you see that although you only have 3 extracts with words, they are very content heavy. So they will have fewer. Typically for CSQ, the number of cases, extracts, the long sentences are about 3 to 5. And data may be averaging 1 to 3. So it is normal to expect there's a mix. Okay, then this is what we have done, the brief look at. So of course, now when I talk to you, I take more time to explain. But of course, when you do this yourself, it will be a lot faster because you don't have to be like me, think of how to explain and write down. You will just be in your head, okay, this could be what, that could be what. So do build up this skill and keep your thought process moving right at the start, so you can get into the mood of the micro concepts and content. Then when you see the question, you wouldn't feel so anxious or not confident. Yeah, this is about confidence and time management as well. Okay, so let's look at the question. So here is 30 mark question distributed across a few mark tier. So before we go into the content and talk about the answer, actually I also want to cover what the different mark tiers mean, because the different mark tiers actually have different requirements. So of course, the lower the marks, the lesser the requirement. You don't have to write so much. But we know that for questions like 8 and 10 mark, they are the long questions and they will tend to have evaluation also. Over the years, 8 marks increasingly became evaluation question. If you look at the econ syllabus about 10 years ago, your 8 mark will be more of the descriptive explanation question, but now they have evaluation as well. And of course, your 10 mark is always evaluation because you need to write more to earn the marks, right? However, to really confirm if the 8 mark is an eval question, you need to look at the keyword, the action word. So we just jump to the keyword first, then we will go back to the first question. So if you see the 8 mark question, it says discuss. So we know that discuss is a word that require you to give a view. So you will have to do an evaluation. So the same for part F, access whether. Access is also about giving a view. Yeah, so good to know what are some possible evaluation words that you can keep in your mind to look out for, to make sure that if for that question you need to do evaluation. Okay, so back to the mark tier, there are a few tiers of marks that CSQ will usually use. So I would split them into 3 tiers. So the first tier, it will be your, okay, so our marks. So for the first tier, it will be your 1 to 3 marks. In this case, you don't see the 1 to 3 here. It depends. Sometimes you will see 1 if it's a definition question, or you will see 3 if it's a data plus 2 points of analysis. But here is 2. So this 1 to 3 mark, usually they will test you on data questions. So they may ask you, okay, looking at this data, what can you infer? Or they may ask you to raise a point and explain it. It's a short one. That's why it is 2 marks. So usually it will be more of a concept. Okay. Let me write it again. Okay, you have a concept plus a simple explanation. Or you have a data plus observation slash simple explanation. It depends on the permutation, but it wouldn't be too demanding. And these are marks that you should secure because these are quite heavily linked to content. which you could prepare before the exam. Of course, the questions sometimes may vary in terms of difficulty, but we will take it as we go. Okay, then you have the second tier, which is your 4 to 7 marks. In this case, you don't see your 5, you don't see your 6 and 7, you see 4. But this is a little advanced than your first 1 to 3 mark, because this is more about your explanation and application of your content. So you will be likely required to draw a graph if applicable, or use a concept to explain for something. So because econs is a lot about given a scenario, use concepts to explain how this happened, or given a problem, use policies to explain how this can be mitigated, things like that. So it's a lot about explaining for something or problem solving for something. So you will see a lot of application of concepts to explain a certain problem or phenomenon. Okay, so 4 to 7 mark. I would say again your 4 to 7 mark is also what you need to score, because this is content. So otherwise, when you look at the highest tier, which is 8 to 10, okay, I haven't seen a 9 mark before, like it will be either 8 or 10, but this is really the most important, because on top of your explanation, your above, you still need evaluation. So evaluation is the one that is the more challenging one for students, because it could be sometimes difficult to come up with a viewpoint. But if you follow our series, you will eventually learn that we will cover evaluation question. There will be dedicated video for it. So do take note of it in the title, where we will talk about when you have different types of evaluation question, how do you structure your answer, how do you think of the point, then how do you use parameters to support your evaluation. Because I think a lot of students at the point of evaluation, perhaps they talk about 2 policy. Then the question is, compare the effectiveness of this policy and that policy. Then you will get stuck. Seems like both policies work, right? So how do I know which is more effective? So actually, for the word, for example, effective, you have to unpack it further to say what constitutes effectiveness. Is it about solving the root cause of the problem? Is this a long or short-term solution? What are the possible impacts? So later on, we will learn that. But today, we will focus on the micro questions. And actually, for the E and F, they are globalization question, which is under macro. So we will skip for this session. Okay, let me erase this, then we can move on to the questions. Okay, so now let's move up to the part A. Okay, so the first question, with reference to extract 1, identify and explain one negative externality arising from the diet westernization in Japan. Okay, for questions, sometimes they are nice. They will tell you, they want you to look from which source or extract or table. But some questions, they don't do so. So for questions that didn't specify the extract that they want you to look at, then you need to look through and see where is applicable. So it's always good to follow. Okay, explain and identify one negative externality. So when we look at the word externality, this reminds us that this is a market failure question. Okay, so the first step is always to know what chapter, because when you know what chapter, then you will be reminded that, oh, this chapter covers externality, covers imperfect info, covers public good, things like that. So it will start your brain to think of something. So always try to establish linkages to existing content that you know. Okay, in this case, because we haven't read the extract, so we are not so sure what could be the answer, but the structure to approach this will be, okay, when we look at negative externality, we know that negative externality talks about your third party impact. So this is about when you do an action, you impact those around you who are not involved in the action. So it could be positively, which is positive externality. Then you have negative, which is negative externality. So here we will need to go to the abstract and understand what happens at the diet westernization in Japan. And then we will try and see anything that is about an action that impacts other people. I would think, of course, the question won't be something that you learn in your notes, like example, factory production of harmful gases that pollutes the air, or smoking causing your secondhand smoke, your lung cancer to people around you, all those. It wouldn't be so easy because that is just examples in the notes. In CSQ, the question will give you something that need you to further analyze, how does this link to the negative externality? So we can take note of that. So this is a 2 mark. So the identifying will be 1 mark and the explaining will be 1 mark. So identifying would be simple, where you talk about, what is the negative externality, but the explaining may be the difficult part, because sometimes it is not so straightforward who is the third party and how they are impacted. So we need to focus on that. Okay, so with that we can go to abstract 1. So you see, when we now structure the question and look at the question, we are very clear what we want to look at. So compared to just now when I just flip open the paper and I read everything, I don't know where is the focus, which is not super helpful. So rather than reading everything and end up not knowing anything at all, I rather focus the reading on specific things lah. So this is a way to manage your time. Okay, so let's go to your abstract 1. Okay, so again we need to look out for things that hints on negative externality, because sometimes the content could be very content heavy. They tell you the context and stuff, but that may not be the most important thing to look for. It will always be what you want to look at for the question. Okay, so let's read on. Abstract 1. Changes in the Japanese diet. In the last 60 years, almost every corner of the globe has seen major demographic changes, like population increase and urbanization with rapid economic development. These processes have played a major role in changing traditional lifestyle, with one example being the significant shift towards diet containing more meat and animal product. Okay, so just now when the question talks about westernization of diet in Japan, it isn't so clear what it is. But now it seems that it is clearer, because if you look at history, actually for Japanese diet, they are very light, hinging more on seafood, the less flavored, because their lifestyle is healthier. So with westernization, with globalization, cultural influences, things like that, even the diet aspect has changed. So I would think the westernization of diet in Japan means that there is more meat coming from the Western countries into Japan and influencing Japanese diet. Yeah. Okay, so here they talk about it. The next line, this has been branded as diet westernization throughout the world. So you may think, throughout the world, but why Japan? So probably Japan has some unique characteristic about this phenomenon that is worth looking into. Okay, such a change in food habits has resulted not just in massive increase in livestock production globally. Okay, so sometimes when you read the case, you can take note of possible concepts. Like in this case, they talk about massive increase in livestock production. So you can attribute this to increase in supply. In case the question asks you anything about demand supply factor, then you can raise this. Okay, but has also contributed to an obesity epidemic. obesity has costs in terms are here. So some keywords will trigger you to wonder, is this a market failure question? Related concept to externality, because this talks about costs. So they talk about, okay, there will be costs in the treatment of health problems such as heart disease, diabetes, and costs such as lower productivity of the labor force. Okay, so here actually it should ring some bells, because here seems to talk about a larger context, in this case the labor force. And we learn from negative externality that when we look at the whole market, we look at the society. So this may likely be a point that you can talk about for part A, where actually when the workers, they are obese or they have diseases, they tend to be more sick, less productive, and they may take more sick leave, for example. And this, their action resulting from being sick as they consume more meat heavy diet, could have an impact to others. So these others could be impact to their team, impact to their company, because maybe when they are more sick, then they are less productive. So overall, the company's performance may get affected. So this may likely be the externality. Okay, this is just a hypothesis because we haven't finished the case. But let's read on to see if there is any stronger point, because the question says one reason, explain and identify one negative externality. So this could be one, but if there is something else that is even more obvious, then we use that. Otherwise, we will have to use this point and answer the question. Okay, so let's move down. Okay, still a lot to read, but it's okay, we take through together. Okay, so since 1961, the production and consumption of many types of meat have increased significantly. Okay, so when they talk about increased consumption, you can also be reminded that this is increase in demand, in case they ask you about demand supply factors. Okay, in particular, the production of beef, sheep, and goat meat has doubled, while the production of pork and poultry increased by 200 and 800%. Pretty significant. Okay, now mention of Japan. Japan is the nation that has experienced the most dramatic shift during the decade, with a relative decline in consumption of fish. So that is the reason why Japan was mentioned, because it was one of the more impacted nation for the meat consumption. Okay, so they now talk about why there is more meat in Japan. So they say a number of factors, with urbanization, rising income, changes in food supply chain. Okay, so here is an interesting point, because when they talk about rising income, people are richer, they can afford meat, which tends to be more expensive, especially beef. So here may be something to do with YED perhaps, but we can just state here. Okay, then they talk about supply chain. There is an increase in the number of supermarket, convenience store, trade liberalization. Yeah, because if you have more closer trade relationship between Western countries and Japan, it also means that there is more trade going on, and Japanese will have higher accessibility to the Western meat. So Japan now imports the majority of beef. So yes, production of beef is not in Japan, mainly overseas, so it has to import, while it imports the bulk of the cattle feed. Okay, not so important. Low self-sufficiency. So they define that self-sufficiency is about able to produce everything you need by yourself. So I think we caught a glimpse of that at the 8-mark question, but because this is a macro question, so we don't talk about that. Okay, then if you find that the case starts to be super descriptive, detailed, right, may be worthwhile to just glimpse through. Like for example, we now read quickly across low self-sufficiency in this increasingly popular component, major concern, how food self-sufficiency is a top policy objective and government want to implement policy to increase it, blah blah blah. Okay, so not so important to our question because we are looking at negative externality. So always keep your objective very clear in your mind what you are looking for, because when the case is very long, there are a lot of information that could dilute what you were looking for. So now don't get carried away to talk about self-sufficiency because we are still looking to answer a negative externality. So just to be very clear. Okay. Then the last paragraph, therefore, Japan's changing diets and the associated food sufficiency challenge is not only critical for Japan but also countries like Australia, Brazil, and US. These countries are shouldering the environmental burden of supplying directly and indirectly to meet Japan's growing appetite for meat. Yeah, because this is talking about, the question talks about the negative externality happening in Japan. So the negative externality that you talk about should be focusing on what happens in Japan. Because when here, okay, the environmental burden may make you think of, could this be a market failure point, the negative externality? But I feel that compared to the one above, this is less obvious lah. So I think we could focus on the point about the workforce one, the impact to the workforce. Okay, so we talk about the lower productivity. So we can go back to the question and plan the points. Okay, so for part 1, explain and identify. So we have identified the negative externality, which is that when the person becomes obese due to more meat consumption, there is more instances of being sick, diseases, so they have to be excused from work, they will be weaker. So this, you can talk about how the individual being sick actually has a negative impact to the workplace. Okay, so this is how you identify, because you talk about when the illness is by the individual but it has an impact on the workplace. You need to explain why this happened, because then the negative impact you can talk about, it will be the lowered productivity. Okay, so this is where your explanation comes in, because why would someone be sick lower the productivity of his or her workplace? So this is your 1 mark. Okay, then your other mark, okay, there's a little space constraint, but I will try to indicate the different points in different color. Okay, so for the other mark to explain, you can talk about when the person is ill, sick, the person need to take more leave, sick leave, and also will be weaker. So when he or she turns up to work, maybe the productivity decrease significantly from the past, and this has an direct impact on the workplace, because this will affect work achievement, work outcome. And when this is lowered, and you can imagine not just one worker being like that, you have maybe a few, then collectively they will reduce the productivity of the workplace. So your work achievement actually decreases. Yeah. So this is how you explain, because it's not sufficient to just talk about how I affect you, that I have an impact on you, but why I have that impact on you. So you see, this is not really a conventional case where I consume this good, I do this thing, I have an impact. This is about something that I experience as an individual, and then how do I impact those around me in a negative way. So you will need some need to spend some time to think about it, which there are some instances where this is not so straightforward. Okay, so this is your part 1, 2 marks. So ensure that you covered both. Okay, then let's go to part 2. With reference to table 1, so again, very nice, they give you the reference. Explain which meat product is considered more of a necessity by consumers in Japan. So remember just now when we talk about table 1, it was about your YED. Then we talk about for the positive YED, there are different magnitudes, right? You have the higher magnitude, which is your luxury. In this case, luxury, I think in the context of meat will mean more of beef lah, because beef tend to be more expensive, like your steak, your different parts of the beef can be a lot more expensive than your pork or your chicken. Okay, then your necessity. So here the good thing is that just now we talked about it already, so we sort of anticipated, the question will ask that. So now we don't need to spend so much time to go and decipher the table. We can just go to table 1 and we look at the YED that has positive value but lower, because they want you to talk about the necessity part. So when we go to your table 1, yes, here we are. So we see that for pork for poultry it has the lowest YED, which means that actually when your income increased by 1%, your Y increased by 1%, actually the demand for the poultry only increased 0.02%, which is pretty small, which means that even if you are more rich, you don't increase the demand for poultry so much because you already have eaten it, or there is just this limit that you can eat for poultry. So your answer would be the meat that Japanese perceive as necessity should be your poultry, because you have to explain and identify first. So you have to identify first. So it would be your 1 mark should be identifying the meat, which is poultry. So for the explanation part, you need to explain how do you use YED to come to this conclusion. So you say that looking at the YED value, which is positive but very low, this tells me that poultry is a necessity, because it means that when my income increase, my quantity demanded of my poultry only increase a little bit. And this is because poultry as a necessity has already been fulfilled to some extent, even when I'm not rich. So when I am richer, there's just a little bit that I can increase its consumption of. Then this is enough. Because you see the question, although is nice to tell you table 1, but it didn't say use YED to explain. So you see this depends on your content. So if you are very reliant on the case to look at the answer, actually the answer is not there. You have to infer. So that's why I mentioned that you need to plan your answer, and then you use the case to see if your planning is accurate. Then you won't run into the risk that the cases talk very little thing, then I only write a little. It is not. When it talks about very little things, this is when you need to add on your own point, especially critical for the higher mark questions. Okay, so we have finished part 2. 2 more parts to go for this session. Okay, then they talk about part C. Suppose the price of imported chilled beef rises. Okay, so sometimes when we see price rises in the micro context, we need to be a little more sensitive, because it could talk about how price increase using demand supply curve. Then we learn that when you want to explain when something has increased in price, you need to talk about demand supply factors, then the price adjustment process, right? So this could be a possible way. So keep the process of thinking about possible concept in your mind. Okay, but we read on. Explain what would happen to total spending by consumers on imported chilled beef from Australia and the rest of the world. Okay, so here you will need to think a little bit more because how do the price increase? How does price increase lead to your spending increase? So actually when you think back of your content, this is covered under your PED. So remember for PED, the difference with the other two elasticity concept is that apart from talking about the definition and the how you apply it, right? Actually, there is a separate session talking about PED's impact on your revenue and spending. So this is about how it impacts your revenue and spending. Actually, for revenue and spending, they are the same thing. You are just looking at different perspectives because your revenue and spending is given by P times Q. So if the question wants you to look at the consumer perspective, it will be spending because based on the price and the quantity that they buy, the spending is the total. If they want you to look at the supplier's perspective, they will say revenue because revenue is what the suppliers will earn from selling the beef. So it is also P times Q. So it doesn't matter. You just need to know that, for this part, I need to apply PED. That's all. Okay. So you also recall that after YED just now, the table below, table 2, actually talks about PED. So just nice. The answer is there already. You just have to apply it accordingly. So back to content. When we look at the link between PED and revenue or spending, in this case spending, how do we apply? So we say that if the PED so we say that if the PED is more than 1 or less than 1, there is a different impact to the graph, right? So we draw something like if PED is more than 1, price elastic, then we will indicate a point on the graph. This is the initial revenue. Then later on, we indicate another point. Okay, use a brighter color. We indicate a different point because now they say price increase. Then how do you show that the revenue, in this case spending, has changed? So actually, from this graph that I'm drawing the one for PED more than 1. So if your PED is more than 1, actually your P times Q decrease. So of course, if you have established that, then the opposite is true. Like if PED is less than 1, then your P times Q increase. This is because if your good has PED more than 1, it means that when price increase, the quantity demanded will fall more than proportionate, and this affects your total spending has decreased. While if your PED is less than 1, the increase in price of the beef will lead to a less than proportionate drop in quantity demanded. Then it doesn't decrease your spending so much because now you have a price higher increase than your quantity demanded decrease. So it's about how the P and Q shift relatively to the PED value. So this is a very important concept to recap, because if you are unable to establish the link between PED and total spending, actually this question cannot do, because then nothing to say. And furthermore, this is a 4-mark question. So again, you see how we are applying content in a more enhanced way compared to your first 2 parts. Now you need to apply the content, look at the different scenario and support your claim. So of course, having more requirement also means you have more marks given. So try to get the marks as much as you can. Okay, then we look at, because the question has 2 parts. One is about Australia, one is about the rest of the world. So I will expect when I go to table 2, Australia and rest of the world beef will have different PED. If not, then I don't have 2 different sides to say. So I'm expecting that. So do identify which one is Australia's PED, which one is the rest of the world, and then you have the conclusion, because you need to say what happened to the total spending. So when you talk about total spending, it is a number, right? Is, for example, I don't know, 2050, which in this case you don't need to know, you just need to say what happened, which can only be increase or decrease. So you see, when we spend some time to plan the structure of the answer, it becomes very clear what you are looking at. So we don't really need to look at the case too much, because we already have an idea what to say. So this is the beauty of planning before that lah. Okay, so we just go to table 2. In this case, you realize that part C didn't mention table 2 already, because they have already told you that for the first 2 part. So you need to own self go and find out, where is the PED data. In this case, it should be, yes, in your table 2. Okay, so see, for Australia, you see that the PED less than 1. So when it is less than 1, the impact to total spending is that it will increase, while rest of the world is more than 1. The impact to the total spending will decrease. So this should be your answer for part C. Yeah, it should be comprehensive, because we talk about the identifying the different PED for Australia and rest of the world, and then we use each scenario when it is more than 1 or less than 1 to talk about the impact to your total spending. So always make sure that you define that total spending or revenue is P times Q. So when you draw the graph, the examiner will know that, I use a P over Q graph. So I forgot to label here, but this is your P over Q. Then it will make sense lah. Okay, just one last part to go before we end the session. Usually our session will be about 1 hour long, so we wouldn't edit any part out. So if you want to really understand the thought process of a CSQ and deriving the answer, please sit through. But of course, if you want to have a double times 2 speed is also okay lah, because I will tend to explain it in a very detailed way. So if you feel that maybe part 1, part 2 I know how to do already, then you can skip to part C, which I will go through in sequence, so not to worry. Okay, so part D, using the info in extract 2. Okay, this one we haven't read yet, this is a new one. Calculate and interpret the cross elasticity demand in Japan between Australian chilled beef and US and chilled beef from the rest of the world. Okay, this question is a little bit long, but no worries, we break them down into parts first before we think of it. Okay, so you see that table 1, table 2 talk about your YED, PED. Then you may wonder, where is your XED? Because that's the only elasticity concept that they didn't say. So here it is, although it is not in the table, but it's being tested. So what does it mean? It means that somehow you have to read extract 2 and try and decipher some stuff. Okay, so just to recap on the concept of XED. XED talks about the relationship between 2 goods. So for PED and YED is 1 good, but how the good demand changes with income and your price. But here your XED talks about 2 goods. So XED we need to know for, okay, I'll write below, so that there is more space, since we don't need the space for part E and F. Okay, so for XED, you have also 2 sides. So you have positive, you have negative. And we know that for XED, the formula is that how the quantity demanded of good A is affected by the change in price of good B. So it's about 2 good. So firstly, you need to establish what is the relationship between the 2 goods. So if it is positive XED, it means that when the price of B increase, the quantity of A increase. So when this is a positive one, the relationship are substitutes, because when something is more expensive, I switch away to a close substitute. So this is a substitute. Then for negative, it will be complement. So when the price of B increase, the quantity demanded of A decrease because both have to be used jointly lah. So the demand for A will be affected by a change in price of B, which indirectly impacted by the demand for B, which is now lower when the price is higher. Okay, so I would think for extract 2, you will need to pick up some numbers and put in this formula. But if you look at the question, actually for beef, I would think they are already substitutes because it is either you eat Australian beef or you eat US or you eat rest of the world. It will be a bit strange if say a meal you want to eat beef, then half is Australian, half is US as a complement relationship. Is a bit weird. So I would think likely that you are looking at substitute, but possibly having different magnitude lah. So you could have a larger one, you can have a smaller one. I think we will see, but at least we know what to look out for. So look out for information in extract 2 that is aligned to the formula. So a change in price of one of the beef, and then a change in quantity needed of the other beef. So keep that in mind when you read extract 2. In this case, interesting because it's a data question, but it's not a data source. It will be in a word somewhere lah. But we just know what to look out for, then you don't need to worry about it. Okay, so we go to extract 2. So in this case, okay, extract 2 is really long, but it's okay. We will read the relevant part and then we will extract ourselves. Because sometimes when you know you have reached your objective, actually you can stop reading lah, because you want to save time and move on. Okay, I realize that this case is very descriptive, so we need to sometimes look through faster if it's not relevant. Okay, so this is the beef imports into Japan. Just nicely tied to the different type of beef, so Australia, US, and rest of the world. So it's still quite a good flow. Okay, so it says with its large population and limited agricultural land, Japan has consistently been one of the world's largest importer of beef. In 2014, Japan imported nearly 3.5 billion of beef product, making it the third largest importer in the world. Yeah, actually when you go to Japan now, a lot of food you realize is a Western Japanese fusion, and beef is really popular, like your Yoshinoya, your Sukiya is all about beef heavy product. Very popular food chains. And your Western ones also, like Hamburg. Yeah. Okay. Then they talk about, okay, the primary sources of this import are US and Australia, which together represent 90%. So, okay, US and Australia were mentioned in the question. Likely they are substitute. So you see they have that competitive element there, where Australia has the larger share with 47%, while US is 44%. So Japan, among the beef that Japan import, 47% is from Australia, 44% is from US. But honestly, not much difference lah. Okay, then Japan regained its position as the largest foreign market, representing over 20%. Blah blah blah. This is in spite of Japan's high trade barrier on beef and beef product. Okay, this one also important because again I have not come to determine my XED yet. Yeah, sorry, I keep saying CED because last time they use CED lah, but I think XED now is more intuitive because you are comparing between two goods. So it's like across two goods, what it means. Okay, Japan's beef consumption exceeded 1 million ton. Actually, the case so far has been talking about how much Japan consumes beef, but nothing much about the different types of beef in comparison yet. Okay, then they talk about declining population, weak economic growth might constrain demand for beef. So actually sometimes when you read the case and you realize that how come I haven't get what I want, right? All this info might be for later part. Because especially your 8 and 10 mark question, they don't really always specifically look at a case. They may look across the case because the details are scattered across. So good to read every sentence if you can. But of course, if the sentence gets too descriptive, then you know no econs concept that is inside, then just pass lah. Okay, so for Japan's population growth, it has been negative. So if you move on to year 2 JC macro, you will learn that under economic growth, yes, Japan is one of the unique countries that has stagnant growth for decades. So you will learn more why. Okay, then the population, actually I don't really need to know about the population, so I can sort of fast forward a little bit. Then okay, but the interesting point is that they say, okay, possibly decrease, right? But it may be offset by the fact that Japan's aging population may contribute to increase in meat consumption. So they say typically meat consumption increases as its population ages. This is a interesting point because we know that in Asia country, the older you are, you tend to eat lighter because it's harder to digest. But I think for Japanese culture, they see beef, meat as red meat, source of protein, source of nutrition, which they think that perhaps the elderly will need more to maintain their energy. So sometimes your diet preference is also influenced by cultural aspect. So it's interesting to learn also. Okay, then they tell me how many proportion of the population is 65. Not so important to me. I just need to know that it's aging. So all this additional info, sometimes you can pass, blah blah blah. Yeah, again, then talking about the demand for meat will fall and increase. I think at this point also important for us, but we can note that it could be increase or decrease, indeterminate. So you can see the demand for beef in the future is question mark, if it's in the future, because they have so many factors at play. So I think these points might be useful for your part E and F, your macro parts. Okay, then last 3 paragraph. Here is the good thing, because you see the next paragraph, if you glance through it, you see some numbers there. So the numbers may be what you are looking for. Okay, so they say there's a tendency for Japanese consumer to import more Australian beef when US beef price rises and vice versa. This is when the concept of XED come in, right? Because they say when the price of US beef increase, the demand, the quantity demanded for Australian beef increase. So just now we established that this is a substitution relationship, which makes sense because they are the same good, just different countries, so they are supposed to be quite close anyway. Okay, so yes, they say there is a strong competitive relationship. So this one is a synonym for saying substitute. So do note that sometimes in content, they don't so explicitly say, this is a substitute. They won't say that. They say a competitive. So you need to know what substitute actually means because they are competing for demand, maybe targeting the same pool of consumer also. Okay, then they talk about how there is a strong competitive relationship of chilled beef across all sources. So actually all 3 you can expect the CED to be positive because they are all substitutes. When an increase in beef lead to increase in import, blah blah blah. Okay, so this one here, I will highlight in a different color. 1% increase in the price of beef will cause import of US beef to increase by 0.74%. So actually now you have your answer for the first part, because they want you to know the XED between Australian and US. Second scenario, Australia and rest of the world using XED. So you need to calculate first and deduce from the magnitude the degree of substitution, because the higher the degree of substitution, the higher the XED value. So I think this is the conclusion that they want you to make, because it's not enough to just calculate, because calculation is just math, but you need to interpret what it tells you. So it would be what you will go for the answer. So for the first XED value, where this is the C part 1. The Australian beef is actually the denominator because this is the one that the price changed, so 1%, and cause the US beef import, in other words demand for beef, to increase by 0.74%. So actually the first XED value is 0.74. Okay, then part 2, Australia and the rest of the world. So your XED will be, again because the price change is on Australia, then the chilled beef from the rest of the world is 1.34. So actually it's 1.34. So you see that these two XED value, 1.34 and 0.74, they are both positive, indicating a substitution relationship, but the magnitude is different. So it actually means that for Australian beef and chilled beef from the rest of the world, it is perceived by consumers to be closer substitute because the value is higher, whereas for Australian beef and US beef, they are weaker substitute. Maybe that's why it explains for the Australia and US beef to be so close, because maybe people see uniqueness in them, then they demand equally, so they are maybe perceived to have some differences lah. So maybe there is some people who like Australian beef, some people who like your US beef, then they compete. But Australian beef and from the rest of the world chilled beef actually not much difference lah to the consumer. That's why their XED value is higher, cause stronger, closer substitute. Yeah, but if you think about it, actually when you eat beef, you can't really tell where it comes from. Maybe if you read the package where it came from, then it will give you it will affect how you perceive the meat, but in reality actually not much difference. Okay, so we calculated the two XED value, and then that was what we needed. So I think the calculation will be 2 marks. And then how do you interpret what? Interpret how close substitutes they are. So you need to know the outcome of interpreting something, the outcome of assessing something, how close substitutes they are. Okay. Yeah, so I think after this part, this is the end of the session. We spent a bit of time doing that, but I thought it is useful because rather than looking at the answer key for answer, at least you know how to interpret and apply, which is a very critical skill across all your CSQ. For essay as well. So yes, actually this took longer than expected, 1 hour, about 1 hour and 15 minutes. Wherever you need, you can just speed up the speed. But yeah, hope this is helpful. So yes, this is also the first video of the series, so do feel free to give us some comments to see how we can improve or what else you want to learn in subsequent video. But we will try to alternate between micro, macro, and CSQ and essay, so we will try to upload once every week. So yes, do stay tuned for the next session. Thank you.